All right, guys, welcome to week 3, day 1. Today we're going to talk about market equilibrium. We're going to talk about some buyer-seller interaction and the way that determines prices, and a little bit about surplus, and then finally about an application of the importance of the supply and demand slopes. So, for before this lecture, you should be reading pages 20 to 22 in your book. This is roughly the section that corresponds to equilibrium. So we've briefly discussed buyers, demand, and seller supply. Now we need to know, how do we predict market outcomes? So what does the model predict price and quantity will be when we've got buyers and sellers making trades in a market? And so this is really useful for policy discussions and business decision making. So in a monetary policy setting, you want to know, like, is the interest rate okay? Is it what we're targeting it to be? Or if do we need to increase the money supply to get to our target interest rate? What is the price of food? So we like to know, kind of what the price of food should be in a perfectly competitive market, keep people well nourished. And then if you're a business, you want to know, like, should we enter this market? Is there profits available? Is the price in the market greater than our cost of production, so that when we produce something, we know we'll make a profit on it? So these are some of the motivations for thinking about the equilibrium and welfare implications of markets. So in market equilibrium, it's just where the price balances the number of buyers and the number of sellers, or the amount of a good being bought and sold. And so we know that there are no resources that are over or under provided in market equilibrium in a competitive market. So theoretically, there's actually no waste at market equilibrium, and that's a good thing. And this point happens to maximize social welfare by maximizing the efficiency with which markets are operating. And welfare is not a government payment in this class. It's actually how well off consumers and or sellers are. And so we know that more is good. All right, so you've probably heard of this concept before, the invisible hand. It's mentioned by Adam Smith in the late 1700s in The Wealth of Nations, and it's later actually formalized in the supply and demand and market equilibrium in late 1800s, early 1900s. And so what the invisible hand is, it's allowing the price of a good to fluctuate according to buyer and seller interaction, which eventually will lead to markets allocating goods efficiently. And what's kind of amazing about that is, doing what's best for yourself is actually good for others in these cases. Not because some planner has said, well, this is the price because we have X people and they need Y amount of a unit. It's just uh, actually doing what you know and taking advantage of the knowledge you have is good for society. And so price is a signal, it's an incentive, and it plays the role of information uh, for buyers and sellers. And so in markets with externalities, this invisible hand is not as efficient at allocating resources. And so when you hear about some argument for the free market, you should ask yourself, what types of externalities are at play in this market, and are the assumptions met for perfect competition? And so we need to talk about consumer surplus now. And so we know that market equilibrium, or allowing the invisible hand to allocate goods, or everyone doing what's best for themselves, will give us this equilibrium that maximizes total surplus, which is how well off both consumers and producers are. And so let's just start with kind of consumers. We know that the consumer surplus is measuring the value a consumer place or gets from purchasing a good, or how well off they are. And so a simple way that economists calculate that is, it's all the area that's above the price but under the demand curve. And so that would be a consumer's willingness to pay minus the actual price they're paying. And so if you're willing to spend like $100 in an eBay auction on an item and you get it for 50, then we're going to call your surplus 50. And so this is just an observable measure of value from transactions. And so we want to know how well consumers well off, and we use this. And so, like I said, for producers, you want to know that uh, the price that you will fetch for an item that you produce is more than the cost than it takes you to produce it. Otherwise, you're getting less than it cost you to produce something, and that makes no sense. So we need to dive into consumer surplus more. And I'm going to use a stepwise demand function, which generalizes to linear and or other functions, as I'll show you. So let's just say we have Zola here who values seltzers for for whatever variety of reasons. They like seltzers because of the relaxation or the enjoyment or even peer pressure, and we can characterize their entire demand as a function of the price. And so, let's say that if the price is 5, then Zola is going to demand 1 case of seltzer. If the price is 4, then Zola will demand 2 cases of seltzer, and so on and so forth until we've traced out the entire stepwise demand curve for Zola. And so even though it's not a straight line, this is also a demand curve because it tells us for every price what the quantity of cases that Zola would like to purchase is. And so let's say for whatever reason that the price in this market is $3 per case of seltzer. Now let's look at what the consumer surplus would be in this case. So the price is $3, and so actually for one, if the price were 5, Zola would be willing to buy 1 case of seltzer. And so from this first case of seltzer, they get it. Zola gets it for $3, but she would be willing to pay up to 5. And so uh, willing to pay 5, price 3, consumer surplus from the first unit of seltzer is 2. All right. From the second unit now, they would be willing to pay, $4 for the case of seltzer, and they only have to pay 3, so their consumer surplus is 1 in the second unit of seltzer. And so what we can say is that their total consumer surplus from these units of seltzer is $3. All right. So if that didn't make sense, now I've got a more, well, maybe not more, but a different example to help it put it into other terms for you. And this is probably the best slide I'll ever make in my life. So let's think about what a consumer surplus for a dog might be from getting a treat, right? So let's say that the good in this market is treats, and the price for this treat is measured in seconds of begging. So I call this trick here beg, and so the price is measured in how long the dog has to balance itself up on its back legs. And so the price isn't in dollars. I'm going to call the price in seconds holding this pose because it's takes some effort to keep yourself that way. And so we're going to measure the value by subtracting the amount of seconds that the dog would be willing to hold the bag from the actual number of seconds that would be required to receive a treat. And you can see that this kind of is a specific example of calculating consumer surplus in a market. So let's add some numbers to this. Let's say the dog would be willing to hold beg for 4 seconds to get 1 treat. And I'm going to call the price of the treat is 2 seconds. So if the dog holds the pose for 2 seconds, then I'll give it 1 treat. And so the dog's consumer surplus is the willingness to pay and the seconds they'd be willing to hold the bag minus the price of the cost of the treat in seconds. And so the consumer surplus in this case is 2 for the dog. And so that's kind of my intuitive example for consumer surplus. All right, so now let's talk more about what equilibrium actually is. For competitive markets, this is what we have. We have the equilibrium is where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, or where the supply and demand curves cross. And this is this orange point, which is equilibrium, which I'm going to call P star Q star in this class. Now, importantly, what this doesn't mean is that price is always going to be P star and quantity is always going to be Q star. It means that in the absence of anything happening, the price and quantity is going to move towards this value in kind of the longer run. So this is the direction that the market would go in via just buyers and sellers interacting with one another in a market. A buyer trying to buy something from a seller, he's like, I'll give you 5. The seller says 10. He's like, no, it's too much. And that guy over there will give it to me for 7. And so that guy comes down to 7, and, so on and so forth until it gets kind of towards equilibrium. And so you have like you comparing prices, you decide whether to buy something, then you repeat. And sellers are like, well, it's this expensive to produce, and I'll adjust my prices. And the buyers will adjust their willingness to pay. So importantly, and I kind of started to show this with the fireworks tent example last week, is that if supplier demand changes, then the equilibrium will also change in the market. So in this example, we have supply shifting out to this supply prime, and the equilibrium changing to this equilibrium prime, this the second orange dot. And what we see here is that after the shift out to supply prime, we have P star being uh, the price in the at the new equilibrium is lower, and the quantity at the new equilibrium is greater than the old equilibrium quantity. So that's these two sets of inequalities right here. And I'm going to ask you to do those in your homework, so be ready for that. And we can see that this equilibrium will move around as supply and demand change, which I showed you why the supply and demand curves would shift in the last week's videos. So welfare and equilibrium. It's a desire to maximize this kind of triangle looking thing. It's would be a triangle if these curves were straight. And our kind of goal, and not goal, but something that we view as an efficient and desirable outcome in economics, is for this area to be as large as possible. And so what's important to note is that when we reach this equilibrium E point, that in a competitive market without externalities, this will maximize the total amount of consumer and producer surplus, or total welfare in this case. All right, so I found this sweet clip that I thought is a good um, example of how negotiation occurs in a market. And it's from Trailer Park Boys. You can watch the clip here, but there is some bad language in it, so you don't have to if you don't want to. But what we have is the Trailer Park Boys are in the middle of a river between the United States and Canada, and they can choose kind of which side of the riverbank to come to, and there are cops on either side who will arrest them and take them to jail. So Ricky is choosing, or he's buying, his jail sentence essentially. And what we have is we have two sellers of jail sentences, the U.S. and the Canadian cops, and we have what happens essentially is Ricky bargains his jail sentence down from what it could have been otherwise. And we see that just having two sellers and one buyer is enough to have this price negotiation happen in a market. And so what we do is the supply and demand for jail sentences pushes the market of that towards equilibrium. And so what that would look like kind of in a graph form is, let's say we have the price being above equilibrium price. So currently P is above P star being here. And so what we have in this case is at P, quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, this kind of gap between them at P equals P. And kind of in general, quantity supplied will be greater than quantity demanded when P is above P star. So because sellers can fetch such a high price compared to what their cost is, they're kind of oversupplying it relative to the equilibrium. And because the price is so high, buyers don't want to buy as much relative to the equilibrium. And so in general, when quantity supplied will not equal quantity demanded unless P equals P star. And so we refer to kind of this situation here, this gap between quantity supplied and quantity demanded, as a surplus. So all the supply beyond QD star, beyond the equilibrium quantity demanded, is wasted supply. All of this is not even being sold in the market at the current price. And so what happens is this puts downward pressure on the price to come towards from P to P star, so that companies can sell all the goods that they are produced, and they don't have to take a loss on the ones that they produced but can't sell at P. And so it pushes the prices towards this equilibrium P star, and equilibrium quantity supplied and equilibrium quantity demanded. Okay, so just kind of talk colloquially about the invisible hand and market equilibrium. Um, Something that's been shown to be an accurate predictor, more accurate than polls, in fact, is people betting on who the president will be. And so I actually took this data off the integrated election markets and plotted it for you. The blue line being the price of a share of Biden winning. And basically, what happens is, say, like at this point around 60 cents, you can buy a share of Biden winning. You pay 60 cents, and if he wins, you get $1. And so down here, when they expected, Trump to win the presidency, you could pay 25 cents for the chance to win $1 if Trump actually did win. And if you really thought Trump was going to win, then you would start buying up a lot of these shares, and that would put upward price on the share of those bets. Okay, and then a less political example of kind of like allowing people to do things to decide what the optimal kind of course would be is at Ohio State. What they have is, you can kind of see where people are walking across the grass here. And what they did was they just let people walk across the grass for a while and saw where the dead grass was. And then you know what you do? You put paths where that dead grass is because that's where people are walking. It's kind of an intelligent design type uh, example. You can go to the Reddit thread if you want. So, kind of the last point I want to start to bring up is that the slopes of the supply and demand have important policy implications, which is basically related to the elasticity. And so, the price sensitivity, or how much people adjust their decision making due to price, will matter for what the optimal public policy is. And I'm going to do kind of a bar tax here because I always think about this. So supply and demand for bars visited per week. You have the private supply of bars, and then you have the demand for bars. And people go to bars because there's some private benefit, and bars are there because they want to make money. And I always think about this in the context of COVID. So, something that doesn't make sense to professors, and you see it on econ Twitter, is why there's like lines for bars when there's COVID-19. And so, largely, what that comes down to is that visiting a bar when there's an infectious disease that 20-year-olds don't die from it as much, but it imposes costs on other people because other people could get COVID who might actually die from it. And so what we say is that there's a negative externality to going to bars when there's community transmission of COVID going along. And so actually, the private plus the social cost is higher than just the private, because you're imposing costs not just on bars who have to produce the bars, but also, say, on hospitals or health clinics or whatever. And so what you have is the private equilibrium, or just the one that doesn't consider the cost to other people of going to bars, is this Q star. But once you start to include the other costs on people that people are typically not taking into account, and I don't just mean college students, I mean, polluters, or people driving to work even, is that there's a negative externality. And so actually, once you include the social costs, the optimal amount of bar visits goes down back to this Q star prime. And this kind of has implications for what do we do about people going to bars more than is socially optimal. And a lot of governments have policies to just ban bars. I actually don't agree with that policy. I think a different way to do things might be to just add an additional tax on bars, um, to make it more expensive and therefore shift the equilibrium quantity inwards while also making tax revenue. And so, and actually, in this case, what we have is we have demand being relatively elastic here. That is, people are sensitive to the price of bars. And so, in this case, you see that this whole triangle would be the social welfare with no tax, and then we move back to just this blue triangle with a tax. And so I actually think a more realistic view of this is that demand for bars is rather inelastic, and that students sometimes really aren't that price sensitive when it comes to whether or not they want to go to bars. And so, if we have a tax on bars due to this COVID, we see that there's not that large of a drop off in the optimal quantity of bars compared to, from here to here or from here to here. And so that's why a tax might make more sense. So anyway, That's all I have for today. We see here, kind of in these slides, that market equilibrium is an efficient outcome, and this efficient outcome can be achieved just allowing people to make their own choices, and this kind of generalizes. However, we have to take into account that externalities might interfere with this allocation process being efficient. Um, Kind of people think that this P star is set by governments or something. That's not true. It's just through the interactions of buyers and sellers and negotiation over the price is how the invisible hand works. And then the shape of these curves really matter for the well-offness or the welfare implications of using public policy to target quantity goals. And so that's all I have for you today. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next video.